Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is David Thoreau, and I'm the president of the Independent Institute. Welcome to our Independent Policy Forum today. The Independent Institute regularly sponsors programs such as our one today, featuring outstanding experts on many different social and economic problems, especially as they may relate to new books. For those of you new to the Institute, you'll find information at your seat. The Institute is a non-profit, non-politicized public policy research organization. We sponsor about 8 or 10 books a year. Many of you may be familiar with our new journal, The Independent Review, as well as other studies that we produce, as well as many different conference and media programs that we organize based on our work in many areas. Each of you are invited to become a member of the Institute and receive our journal and books and other studies, as well as discounts to future events such as the luncheon we have today. I want to particularly thank our host committee for their assistance and kind support in making today's luncheon possible. There's a list on the program in your packet. In recent years, certainly in recent decades, what could be called the established sanctity of so-called statecraft, as George Willis put it, statecraft in general and political institutions in particular, has increasingly been met with skepticism, cynicism, and even a growing distaste among many people in American society and other Western countries. What's been called the corporate state, the welfare state, the national security state, the nanny state, and so forth, though each traditionally championed by left or right or both, today ring more and more hollow to a growing number of Americans. Since the Watergate scandal and Vietnam, politics has taken clearly an increasingly anti-political turn, the subsequent elections producing an ever more impatient electorate determined to throw the rascals out. And what exactly is meant by liberal or conservative is really not that clear anymore. Among academics, many of the theories that long dominated economics, history, political science, philosophy, and law, and too often served to champion a regality, a royalness of government programs in the 20th century, have either been abandoned or at least come to be viewed with a growing suspicion. Today, with the new technologies of communications, the cost of information and its transmission has never been so cheap, combined with the rapid internationalization of trade, the vice-like grip that many governments have sought, feebly so perhaps, to wield and manipulate public opinion and cultures seems to be unsustainable. Collectivism and nationalism, for example, are under assault in countries all over the world. Not only can rule no longer be sustained in the Soviet Union, but government powers are being increasingly shaken in such developed countries as England, France, Italy, Germany, Canada, and many other places, and perhaps even in the United States. The last time Charles Murray graced us by speaking at an independent policy forum, his book, In Pursuit, which many of you may be familiar with, had just been republished in a new edition, and his best-selling book, The Bell Curve, was about to be released 1 month later. The following spring, I asked Charles how he would classify his views, and I asked him if he might consider himself to be a sort of, quote, laissez-faire communitarian, unquote, if that makes any sense. Well, I'm delighted to see that in his new book, he answers my question and sets the record straight. Beginning with his blockbuster book, Losing Ground, on what an increasing number of people view as an antisocial, anti-family, anti-minority nature of the welfare system, Charles has been pioneering critical analysis of many, many government policies, almost sacrosanct policies, especially pertaining to American culture and the fabric of civil society. Now in his new book, What It Means to Be a Libertarian, Charles offers a blueprint very much in sync with what could be called the new anti-politics, or the new political cynicism. A new blueprint to overhaul what perhaps is viewed as a dysfunctional tendency, or perhaps even the dysfunctional nature of much of government, and replace it with a system that safeguards human freedom and fosters human happiness. Charles Murray, as many of you know, is the Bradley Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He's also a member of the Board of Advisors of the Independent Institute. He received his BA in History from Harvard, his PhD in Political Science from MIT. He's clearly a superb scholar and writer, and has become one of the most influential social commentators in the US today. So drawing on the noble tradition of Jefferson, Madison, Tocqueville, Mill, Thoreau, Hayek, and other individualists, classical liberals, Whigs, or today what we may call libertarians, I'm very pleased to introduce Charles Murray.
Thank you very much, David. That was a wonderful introduction. And it's very good to be back here. Actually, it was this morning. As you know, as some of you know, I'm on a book tour. And they provide authors with minders of book tours, which is necessary since oftentimes we haven't the least idea what city we're in, let alone where we're supposed to be next. And I was pointing out to a very capable person who's been helping me that she might want to skip this speech because she's heard it 2 or 3 times already. And suddenly I realized, whoops, the last time I was at the Independent Institute, I said a lot of the things I've been planning to say in the speech today. And so you'll be glad to know, Catherine, that you're going to hear a different speech now than you've yet heard the last couple of days. I want to raise some new issues that I have not raised before, because this audience, many of you are familiar with In Pursuit. Were here the last time I talked. And I would like to expand upon some of the ideas that I dealt with then, and raise a few different ways, I hope, of thinking about some problems in which we have tended to become set in our ways. Let me start by making a few comments about the word libertarian itself. The real word to describe someone, of my point of view, is liberal. Liber, free. That's what the word meant in 19th century intellectual thought. In continental Europe, liberal still refers to someone who believes in a laissez-faire economy and also a great deal of personal freedom. In the United States, that word has been lost to that point of view. It simply cannot be recaptured, in my opinion. The alternatives are first to call myself a Whig, because that's also a reasonably accurate description of what I am, but somehow the book title, What It Means to Be a Whig, did not seem to be one that was going to go very far. And then you have libertarians. Well, a libertarian has a problem with it. It is known to many in vague terms as kind of this flaky bunch that wants to privatize all the roads, and they stay up until 3 o'clock in the morning arguing about whether to legalize, whether child pornography should be legalized as long as it involves consenting individuals of 12 years old. Well, that is true. There is such elements in the libertarian group. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that my friends who call themselves libertarians don't partake of those kinds of eccentricities. Instead, they also are concerned with ways of limiting government that would be absolutely familiar to Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, George Washington, and the rest. They are talking about something as American as apple pie. And the fact that it seems so radical to want to limit government in the ways that libertarians want to limit government is itself a commentary on how far this country has shifted in relatively few decades. Hence, I said, okay, I'm going to come out of the closet, call myself a libertarian, and I am hoping that by using the word, and having others who also use the word in this way, that it will take its appropriate place as a replacement for the ancient and honorable meaning formerly associated with liberal. In the book, I have 3 sections. It's a short book, by the way, deliberately written in a non-technical way. There are no footnotes, there are no tables, there's just one graph in the whole book. This is in stark contrast to the bell curve. And it does not pretend to be a scholarly tome. It tries to give a framework of how this way of looking at the world hangs together. The first part deals with the framework, I'm not going to go into much detail on that. It talks about the basic commandments of libertarianism, which in my view are two. Thou shalt not aggress against thy neighbor, and thou shalt not deceive or defraud. Now, in my view, those are ethical principles. So other libertarians will argue with me on this. I think that if you're going to have a successful limited government, you have to have people who are not only prevented from aggressing against their neighbors because you have a big enough police force, not only prevented from deceiving and defrauding because you have strict enough laws against that, but who also, in their heart of hearts, believe these are deeply wrong things to do. On top of that, however, the limited government which I have in mind does have police forces and prisons and courts to enforce these basic principles of a free society. Thou shalt not aggress against thy neighbor, and thou shalt not deceive or defraud. There is a large role in the libertarian society, in my vision, for tort law. I understand that to talk about a country that is going to be improved by increasing reliance on lawyers may seem to many of you to be inappropriate. And I'm not talking about tort law as it now exists. I am talking about an ancient body of common law which evolved over the years, and as of the 1950s had reached what seems to me to be a highly sensible state of affairs, which, roughly speaking, lawyers in the room can fine-tune this, but roughly speaking said the following. If you are the manufacturer of a product or a provider of a service, and you do something that causes harm to the people who purchase this service or product, you are on the hook. Meanwhile, the people who purchase the product or service have an obligation to exercise reasonable care in the use of that, and you use ancient principles of negligence and liability and nuisance and the rest of it, whereby you can have some fairly commonsensical, quickly heard, quickly decided complaints which enable a vast range of human activities to take place without the interference of bureaucrats. This system worked real well. We also then radically, after the late 1950s, changed it, and changed it very, very consciously. Now, I'm not a conspiracy theorist in general, but it is true that some jurists in the late 1950s, including, I think, a few prominent California ones, consciously decided that there needed to be a change in liability law so that it would serve a redistributive function, so that it would spread the risks involved in the society around, and so the whole concept of negligence on the part of the user was no longer really an issue. Rather, you were just trying to get the money, more generally, for the people who had the money, to help out people who suffered losses, and I think that was a disaster. So I go through this in more detail. I talk about public goods and the kinds of things that government may legitimately do to serve public goods. I will not go into that now, except to observe that public good does not actually mean anything that some politician thinks is good for the public. It has a more thoughtful, legal, and philosophical tradition, and things that qualify as public goods are quite limited. But anyway, all of that is another part of the framework. What I'd like to do first in this presentation is to take a couple of specific examples of how a libertarian state might look and get you to play with the idea of how this might actually work. My purpose is not to send you out of this room absolutely convinced that this is the way to go about it, but I do want you to, I hope, take a different slant. And then I would like to turn to the question of why bother to even talk about a libertarian state given the current political realities. First, the examples that I would like to bring to your attention. Start with education and medical care. Now, in education and medical care, we seem to have two extremely different problems. In fact, ones that seem to have no relationship to each other. I suggest actually there is one common aspect to those two problems. In both cases, the fact that we are suffering some of the evils that we suffer defies common sense. Start with education. The idea that it should be an issue that weapons are being brought onto school grounds by students is crazy. In any kind of reasonable world, there will be schools where if a student brings a weapon onto the school grounds and is apprehended, he will be tossed out on his ear and never allowed back again, or not allowed back again for a very long time, and after some very, very stringent conditions have been imposed, and this will happen like that. It is also absurd that we should be worrying about an educational system that is getting worse. We should be in a situation where education is entering a golden age. Quick example. My children, I have 4, and the younger 2 are now 11 and 7. They come home from school, get done with their homework as perfunctorily as they can get away with, and then go to the computer, where particularly, well, both of them actually, spend hours and hours playing Oregon Trail 2. Oregon Trail 2, for those of you who have not encountered this computer program, is a game in which you try to get from Independence, Missouri to Sacramento, California, or to Oregon City. And it teaches you more about the realities of Western expansion than I ever learned at that age. In great detail, with great historical accuracy, utterly engaging these children, and they think they're doing this for fun. I mean, that's the kind of thing that's out there. Now, the same craziness applies to medical care. We are worried because of the rising astronomical cost of medical care. Let me suggest to you, it's bizarre that costs for routine medical care are rising. In all sorts of instances, the kinds of things that are involved in routine medical care, and by that I mean simple kinds of stitching up cuts and prescribing for the flu, and for that matter, some simple kinds of surgery and the rest of it. In all of these areas, technology is not making medicine more expensive, it's making it cheaper. There are all kinds of things that you can do now much easier, that require much less training than they required before. You also have such things, for example, in the realm of diagnosis, where before what you had to do is take an individual, cram him with as much book knowledge as you could, hope he could remember it, and hope that when he's confronted with a patient with a number of strange symptoms that he can withdraw from his memory all of the various things he needs to make the diagnosis. We are under the impression that that's still what we want, this wise individual who's drawing on all this experience to tell us what's wrong with us. There is diagnostic software now that behind our backs, after we've left the room, the doctor already goes and taps to find out what the problems are. But that diagnostic software doesn't have to be operated by a physician. It can also be operated by a bright nurse practitioner with good diagnostic software at her availability. I know in using these gendered terms, I'm stereotyping, but I can't get used to the idea that doctors are he's and nurses are she's, even though I know it's no longer true. You'll have to forgive me, I'm of a certain age. In these kinds of problems, a lot of what's happened in the craziness is attributable to one thing only, and that is that both education and medical care have systematically been protected from the revolutions which would have ordinarily occurred. In the case of education, we do have a private school system. And so one might say, well, innovation in education can occur because it could occur even if the public schools aren't so hot, private schools could do it. Let me suggest to you that the system of private education we have in this country right now is, in its variety and its quality and innovation, roughly comparable to what a private restaurant system would look like if the government provided mediocre but free restaurants. Which is to say, yeah, you'd have some private restaurants. It would look nothing at all like the incredibly complex restaurant industry we have in this country, where you can get every kind of food from every kind of organization and chain, and you would have, given a situation in which education were financed in a way which permitted the forces of the market to work, you would have changes in education that we cannot even imagine. And I'm not trying to invoke here any particular futuristic version of education in which there are no longer teachers in classrooms. I am assuming that there will always be a place for teachers in classrooms. I am simply saying that we have in place all sorts of things that should be making education better and better, and they aren't, and it's because of the government. And I am saying we are having all sorts of things in place which should be making routine medical care cheaper and cheaper, and are not, and the reason is because the government supports a cartel in which everything must go through the physician. And if government got out of the way of that, we would see revolutions in both fields, which would have enormous advantages for not just rich people, but poor people as well. And so that when one talks about, say, getting rid of Medicare or Medicaid, I can give to you a set of arguments about how medical care would be provided. I can go back to historical precedents and describe for you the ways in which health was improving for everyone in the country before Medicaid and Medicare, and did not suddenly accelerate in its improvement after Medicaid and Medicare. But that's not really the point I want to emphasize to you this noon. I want to emphasize to you the fact that we have two areas of critical importance to American life which stand in sharp contrast to everything else in American life where improvement is occurring by leaps and bounds in fields in which the government does not enforce the cartel, does not enforce regulations which systematically inhibit innovation. And the solutions in both cases is to radically reduce the role of government. Let me turn, as my other example, that I would like you to get to think about, to perhaps the most emotional topic associated with libertarianism, and that's drugs. It sometimes seems to me that to say you're a libertarian automatically means that the chief thing on your mind is legalizing drugs. Well, it's not. To me, it is a relatively minor issue. However, I want you to think for a minute about legalizing drugs. The principal libertarian position is quite simple. People must be allowed to harm themselves. We simply are not in a position to say to someone else, I know what's better for you than you know. It can be true, of course, if you're talking about people who have profoundly difficult mental problems, if you're talking about children, of course that's true. I'm talking about ordinary adults. As soon as you say, I know what's good for you better than you do, you are at the beginning of a kind of totalitarian mentality. All right, that's the principal position, but that doesn't do a whole lot of good in talking to a large part of the population, because you can say that's the principle, and they still are real worried about their children getting hooked on drugs. They're worried about the ravages of a drug culture. What does a libertarian have to say to them? And I suggest that there is a very powerful and commonsensical statement, which goes like this. We do not know how to stop the drug problem using the current strategies of interdiction and punishment. I suppose we could do it if you really went after the user. If you started throwing people who use drugs, even in small quantities, into jail, that might have a deterrent effect. But you aren't going to do it by trying to stop drugs coming in the border. You aren't going to do it by prosecuting the dealers. We know that. So we don't know how to have a drug-free America using the federal government and the police and the prisons. But let's ask a simpler question. I'm really worried about whether my child is going to be exposed to drugs. That's really what I'm worried about. Now, do we know how to run drug-free schools? Sure we do. Unannounced locker checks, immediate suspension of any student who's caught with drugs. Easy to have drug-free schools. You could have drug-free schools. The anti-drug strategy for having drug-free schools free up the schooling system so that parents may send their children to the schools that have as strict a policy as they prefer. And if you have parents who don't want to have unannounced locker checks and immediate expulsion, if they have a more permissive attitude toward drugs for their children, let them choose schools that have that kind of attitude. I'll try to choose the kind of schools I want. Consider the employer and the workplace. How do you have a drug-free workplace? That's also pretty easy. You have as a terms of employment whatever is decided by an employer is the drug-free policy he needs. Now the fact is that most employers do not need to have employees who have never ever ingested any kind of mind-altering substance. They need them to be sober on the job, reasonably sober on the job, and drug testing is expensive. So you impose those kinds of drug use tests that make economic sense, which in most cases won't be that strict. But if you're employing airline pilots, or people like that, then you probably have a little bit stricter policy. And that's the kind of thing that employers are in the best position to decide. Here's the most interesting example of all, it seems to me. How about drug-free neighborhoods? Most of the people in this room live in neighborhoods in which, yes, you may have some of your neighbors doing drugs, but if they are not really a major problem in your quality of life. You have moved to neighborhoods in which people mostly share your values, and you don't stumble over people strung out on crack cocaine when you walk out the door in the morning. You've used money to achieve that state of affairs. You've moved to neighborhoods in which that doesn't happen. The reason it doesn't happen has a lot to do with socioeconomic status. Now, suppose you are a low-income person, and you are trying to, and you have children, and you live in the inner city, and you want to live in a neighborhood in which drugs are not a problem. Well, one of the things that you really want is to have a system in which landlords have very open, free choice about whom they rent to and are able to evict under the terms of the lease quickly and inexpensively. Landlords are one of the great maligned forces for social good in the following sense. Landlords want to rent to people who will pay the rent on time and not trash the property. To the extent that people present themselves to the landlord who look like they're going to pay the rent on time and not trash the property, they're going to get preference. To the extent that they look like they might trash the property, the landlord's going to charge a premium. But it's more complex than that. And to see that, all you have to do is go to low-income urban neighborhoods historically in the United States, which have been patchwork quilts. So that you have in one neighborhood a tenderloin district with prostitution and gambling and the rest of it, and a few blocks away you have a prim and proper working-class neighborhood in which nothing of that sort would ever be tolerated. How did these neighborhoods form? It has a strong analogy to the kind of operation in the economic realm that was described by Friedrich Hayek when he talks about the way that prices reflect all sorts of knowledge that no one person can summarize. So too, the neighborhood formation functions are involved in thousands and thousands of little steps so that a particular set of blocks gets a reputation as being a certain kind of place. And the reason why and usually these are landlords and rented properties, they aren't owned properties in low-income neighborhoods. The reason why the landlord in one of those areas doesn't rent to somebody who looks like a problem, even though he has the money to pay the rent, is because he is under a lot of social pressure. If he's a resident landlord, not to do that. And even if he's not a resident landlord, the fact that his property has acquired a certain value by being in a certain kind of neighborhood means that he ends up renting to certain kind of people. I'm not describing a utopian future. I'm describing the way that neighborhoods really form. And I will also suggest to you that the reason why it is very difficult for low-income people to find neighborhoods like that anymore is deeply implicated with what the government does. Sometimes the government plops a public housing project right down in the middle of a functioning low-income community, which brings all sorts of people, which utterly change the character of that community. They make evicting people who don't pay the rent and trash the property so difficult that it can't be done. They put all sorts of barriers in the way of a landlord looking at a prospective tenant and saying, I'm not going to rent to you because I don't like your face. I don't care the fact you have the money. Now, we have done all of this for some of the noblest of reasons. And they begin with the anti-discrimination laws because of race, and then they have extended into other areas. I'm not going to spend the entire rest of this speech describing to you the reasons why I think that those laws have been counterproductive. I do want you to think about the ways in which these same laws have made it very difficult for people with low incomes to use their character as an asset, bringing to the table something of value that can set them apart and enable them to live with their fellows. Let me go from these two examples. Oh, just the tagline is very simple. The tagline of this is, do you want a system which enables people of all income levels to live in neighborhoods that are as drug-free as they wish, free of the housing market? Well, all of this talks about the federal government, which is much, much smaller than what we have now. Talks about stripping away huge bureaucracies. In the book, I talk about getting rid of Social Security and Medicare altogether. And it may be asked, why bother talking about all of these things, given that we have just gone through a 2-year period in which the Republicans got creamed because people were so frightened of a reduction in the rate of growth of Medicare, okay? Why talk about getting rid of vast amounts of regulation when large corporations are many times quite happy with the current regulatory situation? And they are quite happy with the current regulatory situation because large corporations, this will come as a shock to you, have influence in Congress. And they can get these regulations written in ways that they can live with. Furthermore, they have the financial ability to cope with the cost of these regulations in ways that their smaller competitors do not. There are many ways in which Ralph Nader and a number of CEOs are very happy with the way of working together that they have come up with. And why talk about getting rid of regulation when you have two such powerful forces in favor of sustaining that kind of government intervention? If one takes a snapshot of where we are, I think that kind of pessimism is appropriate. But let me suggest to you that some very strange things are going on in the American polity. And by, I don't mean short-term trends, I mean long-term, profoundly important changes in the way that Americans are likely to be voting over the next 20 years. Start out with the simplest one. The simplest one is that whereas in 1964 about 75% of the population said they trusted the federal government, now about 75% say they don't. Now this alienation from government, here's the proposition, is not a cyclical phenomenon. What has happened is that over the last 30 years, the government has taken on a whole lot of new functions, has not done those very well, but in the process of taking on the new functions has also ceased doing the old functions very well. And finally, and all of this is related, private alternatives have kept springing up to what were one time monopolized government functions. Federal Express, Post Office, that's the obvious example. But there are lots of others. There's a much greater use of private arbitration to sidestep the court system. There are all sorts of privatized police forces. The crazy libertarian idea of privatized streets, what do you think a mall is? In all of these cases, we are seeing, and by we, I don't mean libertarians, I mean ordinary American citizens see a consistent pattern. When they look at the things that private institutions do, by and large, they work real well. I live in a little town in Western Maryland. I can pick up the phone 24 hours a day and order an incredible variety of goods and expect them to show up at my doorstep a couple of days later, delivered by a cheerful UPS or Federal Express man in good shape, and if they aren't in good shape or if I don't like them, I call up the place and send it back, no questions asked. That's typical. On the other hand, if I, let's say, want to get my front porch enlarged, I call the phone, and I get, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes get kind of a sullen voice who doesn't know quite who to send me to. And when I finally get hold of the right person, I got to show up in person down at the courthouse, and I got to go back 3 times, and then they turn down admission finally anyway. The same thing happens with a problem with my water bill, the same thing happens with, you name it. I'm not, this is not right-wing ideologues saying this stuff. This is true. The things that private institutions do in this country tend to be tidy, courteous, and work. The things that government does, other than its most core functions, tend to be untidy, discourteous, and not work. And that's the way the world really is. So that when you say to people, you know, private institutions could do this a lot better than the government does, there is an increasing number of people who say, well, that makes sense in terms of my everyday experience. Another phenomenon that's going on is what Grover Norquist, who's with the Americans for Tax Reform, refers to as coalitions of people who want to be left alone. And again, these are not, you know, these are people who identify themselves as moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans. These are not people who go home and read Friedrich Hayek, you know, before they go to bed. But they just want to be left alone. And the effect of this is to change that old cliche about Americans say they want smaller government except when it's their own benefits at stake. Parents with school-age children, about 5 million of them, by sending their kids to private school, already have voted to give up a government benefit in return for being left alone. Small businessmen who are under exquisitely detailed control as to how they provide their good or service. Incredibly heavy paperwork, and also pay heavy taxes, would be willing to give up any government benefit, in quotes, in order to be left alone. The socially conservative lower middle class, who sees family and religion as extremely important in their lives, sees itself paying taxes to a government that seems in return to do everything it can to undermine their own values. And you have a younger generation of taxpayers who quite rightly very seriously doubt that they're ever going to see that Social Security come back from their FICA taxes. They would love to be left alone and allowed to opt out of the system and pay for their own retirements. These kinds of people offer a real chance for major reform. But finally, there is this to consider. There is also, and this is the least specific, but in many ways I think it may be the most profound of the changes that is taking place. I think there is an increasing awareness on the part of a lot of Americans that they don't have enough important things to do with their time. I know that sounds like a strange statement when we're talking about families where both parents are working all the time and where everybody's stressed out and all the rest of that. But by important things to do with their time, I think there is a sense, particularly as the baby boomers get older, that career isn't everything after all, and personal indulgence isn't everything after all, and that their deepest satisfactions are increasingly coming from family and community. And there is also a still inarticulate sense that a lot of what has happened to social policy in the last 30 years has nothing to do with how much money the government has spent, has nothing even to do with the kinds of negative effects that I've described in books like Losing Ground, but rather the most pervasive effect of what has happened in the last 30 years is that the stuff of life has been moved downtown to the bureaucracies. And that if you want communities that work, that catchphrase community that everybody talks about these days, if you want vital communities, communities must have vital things to do. And the way that happens is if communities are on the hook for doing those things. It's the same process that makes parents do all sorts of things for their children, even when they don't really want to be doing those things at that particular time. I mean, I have a daughter that every Saturday morning has to get taken to a violin lesson 20 miles away. That's not necessarily what I or my wife wants to do on a Saturday morning, but we do it. Similarly, with all parents, we do hundreds of things because we have to do them or no one else will. And it is the same thing with communities. If you want communities that are taking the kind of personal responsibility for people in need, for human sufferings and needs of all kinds, you don't do this with a partnership in which the government says, well, we'll provide all this money and then you other folks will provide little volunteer work. You achieve that kind of vital community if the statement is, it's on our backs, and if we don't do it, nobody will. Well, when I say I sense that, there is probably an element of hope as well as a certainty in that. It is drawn from conversations that I have with lots of different kinds of people. It is based on my own experience of moving out of one kind of depersonalized neighborhood out to a small town where in fact it still is run that way. It also comes from watching lots and lots of my contemporaries who are behaving in the same way. In all of this, I hope I have conveyed what is the central theme of what it means to be a libertarian. And I hope it is one that, that you will contemplate even if you are not fully convinced. And that is that in order to live a satisfying life, freedom and its obverse responsibility for the consequences of one's action is not simply one characteristic of a society among many. It is the core defining characteristic of a society that works. And that society which works is not at all exotic. It doesn't have any presumptions of human beings being perfect. It doesn't have any particularly ambitious claims for anything about human nature, but rather it has both the profound and the deeply compassionate understanding of how human beings live satisfying lives that was held by Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, George Washington. They were right then, and I think they're right now. Thank you very much.
Charles, do you want to answer any questions?
Yes.
How would libertarians define a healthy national immigration policy?
That is how would libertarians define a healthy national immigration policy? A classic example of you have to do two things at one time. The first law of libertarian reform, according to Charles Murray's, is that every increase in freedom must be accompanied by a corresponding increase in responsibility for the consequences of behavior. So if you take away the welfare state, you have an immigration policy where I say have the open doors. Because what you attract to this country historically has been energy and vitality, and I think has kept this nation young and alive. If you have an extensive welfare state and then you add on to that an immigration policy which gives preference for the relatives of people who are already here, you no longer have a situation in which a man is picking himself up from his country, wrenching himself away from everything he knows, and coming to make his way in the new world. You rather have a guy who's been sent an airline ticket by Joe, and then can come over and stay at his place while he sees how he likes it over here. And of course, if he doesn't like it over here, he has a more generous welfare state than he has back in his own home country. You have a very different self-selection policy. So, your answer is, as things stand right now, I say that a rational immigration policy has to be one which has some restrictions. And I don't think you can open up borders under the way we have it now. And so in that sense, I say you have a legitimate police function for the state. But I'm very sad about that, because I would much rather have a situation in which the words on the Statue of Liberty still apply, because I think it has made this nation great. Yeah.
In your new book, on the first 30 page, where it just says what it means to be a libertarian, there's a curious B up in the corner. Is that a computer's error, or is it really meant to read the question at meetings like this?
That refers to Broadway books. That's the printer's imprint. So it's an innocuous. There's no Kabbalistic meaning to that. Yeah.
Could you comment on Prop 209 and Ebonics, two separate issues?
Could I comment on Prop 209 and Ebonics? I have a very. I have for many years felt as deeply as anything that strong affirmative action has been one of the most pernicious policies this country has pursued. And I would go through that in detail, but I believe that as deeply as I believe anything. Whether you're talking about measures of progress for blacks, whether you're talking about racial hostility, all the rest. The idea that it could be declared unconstitutional, that Prop 209 could be declared unconstitutional is, to me, deeply depressing. Ebonics, look, I come from a town where we have Appalachian white kids who need to speak correct English if they're ever going to get anywhere in the world. And if it could be shown to me that it really worked to take kids and work with them in the incorrect English they use in order to get them to speak correct English, I'm enough of a pragmatist to say, okay. As far as I know, that's not true. My more general statement is that I think that one of the things that has been most damaging to education in general, and to black kids in particular, has been saying, oh, it's okay, we don't expect much from you. I think high expectations, no-nonsense expectations are the way to go. Black, white, Asian, whatever. Right at the back there.
Campaign financing reform. To me, it's very frustrating to see money and interest really buy elections. The politicians are the only people that the key to running for office is not your character or what you've accomplished, but how much money you can raise. Where do you come out on that?
You know, I would like to do some empirical work here because it's my impression. Think back 20, 25 years. We all know that the amount of money spent on campaigns at that time was much lower. All right. When you had virtually no restrictions whatsoever of what people could give. And you also had some people who gave lots and lots of money. On the one hand, you can be pretty sure in those cases that if you have a guy who's given, $1 million to a candidate, that probably that elected congressman is not going to directly vote against the interests of the person who gave him $1 million. I think in the sense that influence has been bought, I think that's probably true. But I think it's also historically true that people who were the big campaign contributors weren't calling up their congressman every day to get the congressman to vote their way on particular votes. That was much more broad, diffuse kind of support. It is my view, but it is not one in which I have done a lot of work. It's my impression that the campaign reform act laws which have attempted to limit money have had the effect of intensely focusing the money on certain issues. So now it is true that for every issue that comes up, the congressman is voting in response to some very direct pressures by people whose money he needs. I'm in favor of free speech, and I consider that giving money to a candidate is no different in terms of free speech than Barbra Streisand having a fundraising concert at which she sings and gets other people to give her money. And I don't think that restricting the amount of money that a person can give is an appropriate thing for the government to do. I also believe as a pragmatic matter that if you simply get rid of all the campaign financing laws, period, that you are not going to have an explosion in more money coming into these campaigns, and you're not going to have an explosion of special interests. I think exactly the opposite. I think this is a classic case of the government trying to stage manage something where every time it tries to do something, it backfires on it. And having said that so emphatically, I really need to do a lot more work before I'm absolutely sure I'm right. But I do want to look into it. Yeah, back there.
Would a libertarian society be good or bad for the environment?
Would a libertarian society be good or bad for the environment? One of my favorite chapters in the book is on the environment. A couple of quick comments. For a great many environmental issues, I think extension of private property rights rather than restriction is the way to go. One of the things that human beings do best is act as stewards of things they own, and one of the things they do worst is act as stewards of things they don't own. And that is a phenomenon that each of us has observed in our lives, and things we have owned and things we have rented. Who washes a rental car? It's true of the houses, it's true of, I shouldn't be so flat, it's true of all kinds. A great deal of what happened bad to the environment was a retreat from appropriate tort law of the 19th century in the name of greater industrialization. It became okay to dump affluents into the rivers, even though you were making trouble downstream, and because they wanted economic growth. Well, it seems to me that it was appropriate then, and it's appropriate now, to say, look, if you dump something into the water, you've committed a nuisance in tort law, and you are liable for it. Having said that, I also think that there are aspects of the environment that lend themselves to the classic definition of a public good. Clean air is a good example. If we're talking about one smokestack emitting noxious fumes, then you can go to tort law. If you're talking about 100 smokestacks, then I think that there is an appropriate place for saying you have a non-segmentable public good in which certain government regulation is appropriate. I say that, and then I also say that this legitimate function has been performed by the federal government in idiotic ways, and by local governments too. So I would have huge reforms in the way we go about this, but I think there is a role to be played by the government in protecting the environment. You've had your hand up for a long time.
Historically, in this country, libertarians have protected the political system compared to the civil war. And in Europe, prior to 1914, libertarians created a system which leads to...
Wait a minute. Libertarians created the system which led to the Civil War? Okay, go ahead.
And in Europe, prior to the First World War, the same type of libertarians led to systems that created totalitarian regimes. So how did your system avoid both these pitfalls?
This reminds me of a lot of the discussion of the bell curve. I'm serious, sir, where first I got to say, no, I'm not beating my wife, and then I've got to say that there was a great flaw, a tragic flaw in the Aristotelian sense, I think, in the creation of this country, in which it was thought that you could have a free society coexist with slavery. But slavery was not a libertarian principle, and the people who created this country did not say, oh, we think slavery is great, we want to keep it. It was, well, Thomas Jefferson himself was forced to remove from the Declaration of Independence a reference to wanting, the reference which would talk about getting rid of slavery. They made a huge mistake, but it was not libertarian principles that produced the Civil War. And I would also, we'd have to talk for a long time before I understood your relationship between libertarian governments and the totalitarian governments of the early part of the century. I suppose it has to do with the immiseration of the poor, or that sort of thing. And there I think we have some serious empirical arguments. Too big a question for me to deal with in full. Yes?
Public education is a public good. That's the best way to pay for it, especially for children of the poor.
In the book, I say vouchers, unrestricted voucher. I have to tell you, the question was, what's the best way to deal with education if it's a public good? How to pay for it. And I said vouchers. There is a very serious set of arguments on that. I cited Milton Friedman in Pursuit as my foundation for being in favor of vouchers, unrestricted vouchers, whereupon Professor Friedman wrote me a lovely long letter saying that I had correctly cited him, but he'd since changed his mind. But I'm sticking. I wrote him a letter back saying, Professor Friedman, I'm in position of not being able to answer your arguments, but I'm still not persuaded. So I'm sticking with vouchers. Yeah.
Several months ago, the Chronicle, in fact, some of you may have seen it, had a story about the high price of marijuana in San Francisco. We had a picture of a guy named Jake down in Haiti who said, oh, the price has gotten so high, I can hardly afford it with my welfare. I sent my dog to Little Grants and other people. I said, gee, as a taxpayer, why can't I require drug testing of people? We're on welfare, they seem like they're paying taxpayers. It seems like a logical way to control the use of drugs. What is your opinion about this?
Well, so the question has to do with why not be able to require drug testing of welfare recipients, and I have heard similar arguments made, why shouldn't it be appropriate to require young women who are on welfare to have Norplant? Now, on the one hand, I will grit my teeth and say, if you have a government benefit, it is not a right, and the government may attach to that benefit whatever requirements it wishes, including, well, drug testing or Norplant or whatever. And I say that, gritting my teeth, because I think that is symptomatic of the way we may end up going. Because that really is opening the doors to a really authoritarian degree of intrusion into people's lives, which starts from an appropriate premise, but then, well, if we can require Norplant for young women on welfare, why not? And then you can sort of imagine for yourself the extensions. And with regard to that, let me say that one of my, I've given you a fairly optimistic look at what's possible today. One of the things that scares me most about contemporary liberalism is the degree of cognitive dissonance that is involved. Where you have large numbers of, I'm talking about a lot of academics and intellectuals with whom I have had a variety of contacts, who are saying one thing, and they will talk about the injustices of the American criminal justice system and how it oppresses blacks and how it does this, that, and the other thing, but you can be damn sure they are living in safe suburbs to which they have moved. And they will talk about the importance of the public school system and the way it's been a democratizing force in the United States, and you can be damn sure that their kids go to schools that they think are good, and if they have to be private, so be it. So you have this kind of cognitive dissonance where they're saying one thing and thinking another. And the psychologists will tell you that when cognitive dissonance is finally resolved, because it does create internal tensions of very large proportions, when it is resolved, it is not resolved by people calmly going toward the middle. It tends to go, the fervor of the newly converted. And I see, and I'm not trying to demonize the left here, I believe this, I see a real danger of an authoritarian reaction in this country in which certain elements of the right are joined enthusiastically by members of the left. And so in many ways, proposing a free society is something that seems to me even more urgent now than before. Yes?
Can you think of a way to popularize these ideas in common culture, especially among the dominant music?
Well, that's sort of why I wrote the book. It really is true that I hope that this book makes the word libertarian not so flaky. I really hope that it helps contribute to a broader understanding of this way of looking at the world. And I think the first step in doing all of that is to engage in a dialogue. I think the libertarians have had a tendency in the past, because they do have a very strong set of principles upon which you can erect an isolate, correct theoretical structure. So you can say A points to B, points to C, points to D, the same way that the Marxists could. And that libertarians have tended to argue that way. And so when it comes to drug legalization, for example, they have started out with the principle of thou shalt do not have the right to interfere with someone else's right to harm himself, and have not been willing to come to grips with the question, well, but how do you deal with the collateral effects? So talk about a trite answer, but I think it is to engage in a dialogue where you were trying to come straight to grips with the concerns that people who aren't libertarians have. Yes. I've got two people, excuse me.
The latest issue of National Review, you wrote posing a rhetorical question to Professor Arthur Jensen about why he didn't get mad when he was maligned. And I've seen you maligned, I've seen you lie about, I've seen you misunderstood, misquoted. I've never seen you lose your cool. How do you do it?
It's just so I irritate the people who are coming in. It's really true. If I thought I could get away with getting angry, I feel angry a lot of times, but it makes them real mad when I don't get angry. And then the one behind there.
You've expressed alarm, and rightly so, as a libertarian, against the increase in power of the federal government. I would like to know what happened to that clause in the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, that designates certain powers to the federal government, and then all other powers are presumably, that's my word, reserved to the states. Now, whatever happened to that clause, is it being ignored for, or is that still in effect? Powers reserved to the states, so not specifically given to the federal government.
I'll repeat, the main point of the question was referring to the clause in the Bill of Rights, which says that all rights not specifically enumerated in the Constitution are reserved to the states and the people respectively. Yeah. There are the 9th and 10th amendments actually to it. Robert Bork refers to them as ink blots now. And I think as a correct statement of constitutional jurisprudence, that's about true. They simply have no meaning. you take something like the Interstate Commerce Clause, which says, you know, the federal government shall have the power to regulate commerce among the states, which sort of meant you can't put up toll bridges between the states. And that now is the justification for virtually any kind of federal intervention. And similarly with other aspects of the Constitution, those two things don't mean anything. That the Constitution, we're in big trouble in constitutional interpretation. Yeah.
Given the present state of the judiciary in this country, if the government issues school vouchers, how do we prevent the government from attempting to influence school policy?
The question is how you keep vouchers from becoming a desperate trap and destroying the private school system in effect. That is such a serious question that when I say I'm for vouchers, and I think I actually have the sentence in italics in the book, they must be wholly unrestricted. But as you're shaking your head, I see why you're shaking your head, all right? Because you can see all the ways in which that can be gotten around. I just don't have a pat answer for you. I think all we can do is say, look, it's important that poor children have a shot at a good education. And this is one of the best ways to do it. And then trumpet loud and clear the fact that the government must stay out of regulating the schools. But I'm very sympathetic with your statement.
Public education, I come to the conclusion, is nothing more than an extension of the welfare state, and it's nothing but welfare. And over the years, I paid for my own education. And why not just abolish the whole dadgum thing? Let the parents, they brought the kids in the world, let them, pay the whole freight. If they have to homeschool, fine. I mean, come on, 75% of adults do not, have any kids anymore, whatever. So just get rid of the whole thing, get the government out of it.
Well, Milton Friedman, in his letter to me. No, let me go on, because it relates to this. He said, look, the reason that education is a public good is because you can't run a democracy without an educated electorate. But where he changed his mind was, he said, look, it is quite obvious from history, including some of this history that I cited in Pursuit, that even absent a government-financed educational system, you would have a very high proportion of people being educated, and you would achieve the public good without state financing. Furthermore, to reinforce your point, I don't think it is the case that if you got rid of state financing, that you would then have poor children who wouldn't have a chance for education. It's fascinating to read. In the earliest schools established in the United States, long before the Common School movement, the degree to which it was taken for granted that there was provision made for children whose parents could not afford to pay the fees. Okay, I said all that. And it comes down to a narrow choice. And where I come down is as follows. Children are different from adults. There are all sorts of ways in which the inequalities visited upon children cannot be redressed by the states, by the government. I don't want to get the government involved in many of them. As I look at education, I say that's one area in which it is appropriate for children that there be a method that we can be sure that there is an opportunity out there for everybody. If you want to say to me you think that that would also be out there as well without state financing, I think that's an important argument to have. I come down on that side, mainly because children are involved. One last question. Yes?
The libertarian agenda of deregulation and privatization seems to strike the same egalitarian chord that the bell curve did. What is your response to the argument that this is simply an effort by the upper middle class to abandon any social obligations they might have to the less able?
It's an amazing thing about the last question. They're always one like this. I mean, the question, isn't this just one more You know, the guys who have it say, oh, let's have this libertarian society because what that'll do is enable them to secure theirs and leave the others behind. And in fact, the New York Times review of my book says that the bell curve is actually in contradiction to the happy prospect in this book. A theme I did not go into because I did it at the last time I spoke before the Independent Institute is that it is precisely in order to provide satisfying lives for a wide range of people that you need to have vastly decentralized functions. That when I talked briefly about the satisfactions of life earlier, the question at the end of the bell curve that concerned Dick Herrnstein and me was, forget about economics for a minute. Just ask yourself how it is that people who have the short end of the stick, whether it's in terms of intelligence or industriousness or charm or whatever else, how do you have a society in which there are a rich number of roles for those folks to fill? Authentically important roles. We call them valued places. So that they can reach this age of 70 and look back on who they have been and what they have done and be authentically satisfied with their lives. And we argued in the bell curve, and I argue in this book, and I also argued in Pursuit, that in order to do that, you come down to a few core roles. You come down to the core roles of spouse, parent, neighbor, friend. The only way to enrich those roles is to decentralize the kinds of functions which have been sent down to the bureaucracies. If you were then to say to me, oh, this is going to cause people starving in the streets and all sorts of other kinds of physical miseries, then I'd say, okay, you've got a point, maybe we have to rethink whether we're going to do this. I will argue not only would that not be the case, it is precisely by this kind of free society that you are once more in a post-industrial age going to have places that people can fill, that you are going to provide sources of satisfaction, that it's the people in this room who de facto live lives that are free enough already, and that it is precisely these other people to whom freedom has been denied, and for whom the denial of that freedom has been most tragic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Charles, and thank you, everyone, for joining with us. For those of you who haven't seen the book, this is Charles's new book, published by Broadway Books, which is part of Bantam. And if you're interested in a good, personal, and short read on the subject, I recommend it to you. We hope that you'll all join us at our next Independent Policy Forum. Thank you very much for coming.